So the next thing we are going to work on is building the blog side of our website. For this, we'll be using Contentful. So Contentful is a content management system. We don't want to be adding our content manually in the code. So that's why we would want to use a package or a library like Contentful. So Contentful has an API that we can use in our React to achieve this. So you would have to create a new account here, and after that you will need to log in. Because I already have an account, I'm not going to create a new one, so I will navigate straight. In here, I will go into the content model, and for the content model, we are going to create a new content type. So let's go ahead and click on this content type. So what this content type or content model does is it's the place where we would have to define the structure of our blog. So let's create our new content type, and for this I will call it personal portfolio blog website. You can decide to name it anyhow. You can decide to name it however you want it. And for the description, I would describe it as my personal blog page content. And let's go ahead and create it. Now we would have to add some fields. So for example, we would want to add some content to our blog. We would also want to add title, images, and so on. So the first content type we will add is our blog name. So I'll go ahead and click on this add entry or add a field. In here, we have different types of fields that you can add. We have the rich text, which we will make use of later. We have date, normal text, media, and other type of fields. For now, we will choose the text. In here, when you open, you have two types of text that you can use, the short format and the long format. We will only need the short format for our blog entry name. So I will go ahead and type entry name. So this will be the same as our blog title. You can also decide to name it as blog title. I will click add, and now we have the blog title. By default, we want this to represent the entry. We want this to represent the blog title. So whenever we add a new blog, we want this name field that we have added to be the title of the blog. So I'll click this one. In addition to that, we want this to be required, and also we want it to be a unique field because we will be making use of it as an ID when we are rendering the different blogs that we will have. So let's make this a unique. Of course, this model will come with its own ID, but on the front end, when we are making use of this blog, we want to display the blog name as the ID in our URL. So that's why we need to take this as true. So I'll go ahead and confirm this. Next, we will add the main blog entry, so the content of our blog. For this, we'll be using the rich text. So what the rich text does is it gives you the ability to add different formats of text. So you can add code formats, paragraph, different headers, links, lists, and that's what we want for our actual blog content. So for this, I will name it blog entry, and I will add. Here, I also want it to be a required field. So if there is no content, we don't want to allow the user to publish anything. So that's the only thing I would make required in the validation. So as I mentioned, we have different types of headers, different types of formatting, for example, bold, italic, or underline. We have code, supertext or subtext. So different types of things that you can do here. In addition to that, you can also add different assets. So this is a very good content or text editor that we can use for entering our blogs. So I'll go ahead and confirm. We would also want to add a block summary. So that's also going to be a text, but this time around we want it in a long format. So I'll click on the long text, and here we will give it as block summary. Let's go ahead and add it. This is also required, so let's go ahead and save it. The last thing I would want to add is the block image. So for each of our block, we want it to have some sort of image. This is optional, but I think a block without image is a bit boring to read. So personally, I'm going to make this a required field. So I'm going to name it the block image, and I will just allow one type of file, or one file. And in here, I'm also going to make it required. So essentially, all the fields that I added are required. So I'll go ahead and confirm this. So now we have all the fields for our block entry added. Let's go ahead and save this. After saving this, the next thing we would have to do is to navigate to our content. So right beside the content model, we now want to add some content. So when you navigate there, I have already added some content in here. So because I've already added some content for test purposes, I'm now going to select the new one that we just created. In here, I'm going to add a new entry. So let's go ahead and add a new entry. So as you can see, all the fields that we added are highlighted here, and it's highlighted in red because we mentioned that we want it to be required. So I'll go ahead and quickly add some content here. So feel free to add any content of your choice. All right, so now after adding all your content, the next thing we would want to do is to publish the content. So I'll click on publish, and now if we navigate back to the main page or the contents page, we can see that I've already added 3 blocks. So now we will dive right into the code in a couple of minutes. But before that, we also want to add some sort of tags to these blocks. So I'll go into one of the blocks, and in here we can see the tags. I'll go ahead and add a tag. Let's say this is called TypeScript, and we will create it as new. When we create it as new, we want to make it either private or public. In here, I'll select public and create a new tag. I will also add a backend. So now I've added 2 tags to this. I'll go ahead and make the same modifications for the rest. And as you can see, if I go back, because I changed it and I didn't publish it, it's showing the status as changed. So always remember to publish after you make any changes. So I'll go ahead and publish these changes, and I'll go back again in the tags. I will add a new tag. Let's say this is data structures. We will also make it public, and then we will also add algorithms, for example, and also make it public. I'll go ahead and publish these changes, and lastly I will do the same for the last block. These are random blocks that I copied from my own personal blog. So let's say I will add algorithms. I will add a new tag called sorting, make it public, and let's say I can add TypeScript. All right, so that will be all the configurations we will need for our content itself. The next thing is we would want to connect this to our front-end application. So we will have to get some API keys from here, and in order to do so, we would navigate into our settings, and we will go into the API keys. So we would have to generate a new key. I have already generated one for myself, but generating a key is quite easy. You just click on the add API key, you give it a name and whatever description you want, and it will give you some keys. So let me go ahead and create another one. So personal blog API key, not for testing, and I'll give it a description for demo, and I'll add my API key. So as you can see, it gave us the space ID, the access token for the delivery API and the preview API, and also our environment is on master. So we would have to save this because we will need them on our front end. So go ahead and copy these three: the space ID, the content delivery API, and also the environment. Make sure you save keeping it as master. So anywhere you will remember this, please do that. So let's go ahead and go into our code and make the necessary changes. So back in our VS Code, I'll go ahead and open a new terminal. In here, I'm going to create a new file, and we will call the file environment. So .environment, touch.environment. And this file would also be included in our ignore because we'll be adding some sensitive data. So let's go ahead and add this to our git ignore so that we don't commit this to GitHub. Later on, we will configure Vercel, which will be the application that we will use for hosting this website. So let's go ahead and add some environment variables. So for this, I'll be using the Vite. If you are familiar with React, usually when you are adding an environment variable in React, you start with React, but because we are using Vite, we would have to use the Vite to write our environment variable. So we will need the Contentful space ID, and in here you will write your ID. The next value we would also want to save is our Vite. Is our Vite Contentful, and then we will need the access token. So you go ahead and you paste your access token here. And also we will need another environment variable, and this one here we will call it our content type. So contentful, and we call this content type. And this content type, if we navigate back to our Contentful, so let's go back in here and we go into our model. We click on this model that we created. We can go ahead and copy this ID. So this is the content type that we need. So I'll paste mine here. And that will be all for our environment configurations. So next, I'll navigate into our source folder, go into the hooks, and I'll add a new hook, which we will call use fetch blogs.js. And for this, we would also have to install the Contentful package with npm. So let's go ahead and open the terminal, and let me npm install Contentful. So this will install very fast. Yes, so the installation is done. Now let's go ahead and implement the fetching the data that we have added. So I'll go ahead and import, use effect, and also use state from React. I will also import the create client from Contentful, and I will define I'll go ahead and define my hook. So export const use fetch blocks, and this is not going to take any parameter, and let's go ahead and return. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a client. So let's define a constant called client, and we will use the create client we imported from Contentful. So this is expecting some parameters, and these parameters are coming from the environment variables that we declared. So let's go ahead and create a client. In here, I'll add an object and pass the following. For the space, we can import .meta.environment, and we can use the vid Contentful space ID we defined. We will do similar for our access token. So I will just replicate this, name this access token, and modify this to access token as well. So that will be all the requirements from the client. Optionally, you can also add the environment. So we can add the environment, and here we can provide the master. But this is an optional value that you provide, so it's not necessary. I'll go ahead and clean this, because the reason why it's not necessary is because by default it's set to master. So if you haven't made any changes, then you don't need to redefine it here. So now I'll go ahead and define some states. So I'll define the block state, set blocks. We will use states, and we will set it to an empty array, or optionally you can set it to null. We will also set loading, and for this it will be a boolean. So by default we want to set it to false. We also want to set error, and we will use state, and this will also be null. So now we will use effects to render. We will use effect to get the blocks, and we'll provide an empty array as the dependency list. So let's go ahead and define a function. We will be calling this function fetch block post, and this is going to be asynchronous. So async, we are not expecting anything as a parameter, and let's use the try catch. So if there is an error, we want to set our error state to whatever the error was. Okay, so in here we will be expecting some sort of response, and we will now use the client that we defined earlier on. So let's await and client.getEntries. So what this will do is it will fetch all the entries that we have. So if we navigate back here into the content, this is going to fetch all the data that we have defined here. And this is also expecting some values as an object. So the first thing we want to pass is the content type, which we already added. So let me go ahead and add the content type, and we can import the same method we did here. And now we can provide the content type. So it will use this to filter or find all the entries that we've made that has the content type matching what we have in our environment variables. But before we fetch this, let's set its loading to true. And once we have fetched this, we can set its loading to false. Lastly, we would also want to set blocks to whatever the response was. So the response will return some items, and we will set that in our block state. Lastly, once we are done defining this, let's go ahead and call it. So we'll call it down here, and we will also return the blocks, loading, and error. So this will be all the necessary code that we will need to fetch the content from Contentful. This is pretty easy, in my opinion, because if you use something like Strapi, then you would also have to do a very complex setup on the back end and also configure a database and other things to get this working. So Contentful is very easy to start with when it comes to a content management service. Let's go ahead and navigate back into our main.jsx, and I will navigate into the app. Yes, so the app.jsx. Inside my app.jsx, I'm going to import the hook that we just defined. So let me go ahead and import use fetch blocks, and I will destructure our blocks, loading, and the error. Then we can use the fetch blocks. All right, so for now, let's console log and see what it returns. And let's also console log the loading state. And lastly, we will console log the error. All right, so now we'll go back into our browser, and let me open the dev tools. Let's reload this page. So as you can see from here, the first time we loaded, it was false, and we have empty blocks. Let me increase the font for this. All right, so the first time we had the loading being false, our blocks is null and error is null. And then we had the block state set to null and our loading to true, and we have some error. So we have my access token is invalid, so I will need to fix that, and that's because I haven't changed it yet. So I'll go ahead and fix it. All right, so now getting back to this, we can see that after a while it fetched the blocks, and in our content, in all content, we have 3 blocks. And if we open this object, we can also see that there are 3 items. Let's explore each of them. So if I open the first one, we can see we have the objects with keys, fields, metadata, and this system. So for the fields, we have the block entries, And for our first block, we have the entry name here. We have the block summary, we have the image, and we also have the block entry itself, which is the rich data that we added. For our metadata, we have the tags that we added. So for example, if I click on this, we have the algorithm tag that we added. We also have the sorting. So the different tags that we added are also here. Let's explore the image. So for the image, for example, we have the image file. So this will be the URL that we will need to render the image. And then we have the image description also. This, I left it empty. So if you didn't leave it empty, then this will have some sort of data. And we have the block summary, which is a text type, and then the entry name. So that's pretty much all we need for our blocks data. So in future, if you want to add blocks, you just add them straight into Contentful, and we are already consuming it in our code, so it will automatically display whatever block you publish on your Contentful page. So now that we have our data loading, we will go ahead and implement the blocks page itself. So let's navigate there and start making the necessary changes. So back in our VS Code, I'm going to go ahead and remove the console logs. And now in our component in shared, I'm going to add 2 new components, and we will be calling the first one loading, and the other one we will call it error. So what we want to do is, when our blog page is still loading, we want to show the spinner. So let's go ahead and import React from React, and I will import an icon from the React icons library called the FA spinner. So React icons, and import it from the FA library. I will define a new component. I'll call it the spinner, and this is going to return the following. Before that, let's just go ahead and export it as default. So for this, I'm going to define a div. Let's add the closing tag. Okay, that has already been added. And I will call this spinner icon that we are importing, and I'll give it a size of 48. Also, I'll go ahead and give it a class name, and I'll make it animate spin using our Tailwind, and that will be all. For this, I'll give the main container a class name also. I'll make it flex. I'll make the item center so that this displays in the center, and justify also center. And lastly, I will want it to be full screen. So screen size or screen height size should be full. So that will be all for the spinner. Let's go ahead and implement the error. The error is quite similar to this. So I'll go ahead and import React from React, and I will import this component called TB face ID error, and this is also coming from the React icons, and it's coming from the TB library. So now I'll define my error component, and I will export this as default. Let's go ahead and return this. So as similar to what we did for the loading, this is also expecting a div as a container. We are going to render this icon that we just imported. We will also give it a size. Let's make this 100 and also make this 100 so that it's a bit bigger. Add the closing tag, and I'll go ahead and give this a class name. So for this, I want the text color to be red. I have to quickly verify yes. Okay, so the text color is error instead of red. All right, let's go ahead and give this a class name, and we also want to center this. So item center, justify center, and also we want the screen size to be full, and we want it to be flex column. The reason for it being flex column is because we want to add some content here, and this we will just type something went wrong while loading blocks. Please try to reload the page. Let's add some emoji. Here I'll add a class name. I'll give it a margin top of 4. I will give it text error, and also I'll make the text extra large, and I'll make the font semi-bold. So that will be all for this error and loading component. Back in our app.jsx, I will import these two components. So I will import the loading from components, shared, and loading. I will also import error component, and let's add component here. All right, so now what we want to do is if loading, then we want to return this loading component we just created, and if there is an error, then we also want to return the error component we just created. Let's go ahead and save that. For testing purpose, let's assume this is not just for us to see the component and how it looks like. So if I come here, you can see this is the loading. Let's also check the error. Let's save that and come back. So we can see this is how the error also looks. So we can see our component is rendering as expected. Now, if I quickly reload it, you will see for a split second, it will show the loading sign, but that's for just a very few seconds. So you can see it's loaded and rendered the necessary blocks. Now we are not using the blocks that we defined, so that's what we will do next. We would have to change this to use the actual blocks data that we entered in our Contentful. So let's go ahead and make those changes. So back in our VS Code, I'll close these tabs that we are not using. And in here, so for the blocks page, I'm going to pass the prop blocks. And when we navigate back to the blocks component, I'll add the blocks, which is something we are expecting. So now let's go ahead and implement the blocks. All right, so now let's go ahead and make the blocks. So for this one, I'll clean this up, and in here I'm going to give it a class name. I'll give it flex, make it flex column, give it justify center, and then also the item center. I'll give it a padding top and bottom of 10. And I will go ahead and also add another div. And in this div, I will also give it a class name. In here, I'll give it a margin bottom of 10, padding left and right of 5. And for medium and larger screens, I want the padding to be 40. And I want the text centered. Lastly, I will give this a header 2, and I'm going to name this blogs. Let's give it a class name. I'll give it a margin bottom of 3, a text size of 5 extra large, and for medium and larger screens, I want the text size to be 6 extra large, and for even larger screens, I want the text to be even bigger, so let's give it 8 extra large. Let's save that. So if we go into our blogs page, we can see we have it here. All right, so next I will create a p tag, and in here I would say here are some of the blogs I've written. All right, and then I would also want to import the divider. And let's save it. If we go back into our browser, we can see it here. Back in our VS Code, I will go ahead and continue adding the content. So we would also want to add some inputs, and this input is going to be a search. So I'll give it a type of text. I will make the placeholder search blogs, search blog instead, and I'll give it a class name. I'll make the width full. I'll give it a margin top of 5. Outline, I want it to be none. And for the background color, I will give it this specific color. And I'll make the text white. For padding top, left, right, bottom, I want it to be 3. And for border, bottom, I want it to be 0. And then I want to give it a margin bottom. Let's add a margin here. So margin top and down to be 5 instead of just the top. And let's close this. Also, I'll give it an area label. And I will call it search blog. And on change, we are going to create a function to handle the search change. Let's go ahead and add that. So call it handle search change, which will expect an event. And we can set our search query. So set search. We haven't created a state yet, but we'll create it soon. To be event dot target dot value. And let me go ahead. Let's import React and also import the use state from React. and let's define the state. So we'll call this search, and we'll do the set search. We'll use state, and we'll give it empty string for now. So now we can pass the value as search. Let's go ahead and save this. So now if I type, let's say hello, nothing happens, but we can see our entry is here. So we will make use of this entry to filter the blocks that we see. All right, so let's go back into the code and continue with the implementation. So now that we've added our search, we would want to work on rendering the actual component. So for the actual component, let me go ahead and close this. And in here, we are going to define a new div to do that. So for the div, we'll be mapping through the blocks. And we will also want to filter the blocks. So what we want to do is we want to check if whatever we search for matches with the search query. So we can do block.filter, and we can get the block. In here, we can console log our blocks to see what value we want to use. So if I come back here, of course there is an error here, so let's temporarily remove this. So in here, if I click on the block, each block has the fields and the entry name. So this is what the user will probably be searching. So we want to enter this in the search query, and we want to compare this with whatever is in our blocks data that we are receiving. So let's go ahead and check if our block dot fields dot entry name to lowercase, because we don't know how the user is entering this. So let's just convert everything to lowercase. Includes our search query dot to lowercase. Then we want to map the block. So this will filter only the matching letters of the entry name with whatever the user has searched for. And in addition to that, we want to now map each of these blocks and render the actual blocks. We'll get the block, and we are going to return the following. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get the block ID, which will be block.sys.id. So this is the block ID, .sys.id. And there is a typo here. This is supposed to be G. We will also want to define the block title, because we will be using it in different places, and we name it as entry name. And lastly, we will also need the block link, which we will define later. We are going to define this later. So now let's go ahead and create the actual component. So I'll create a new div. And this will be our return value. So let's wrap it around a bracket. And inside this, I'm going to also render another div. And let's give this a class name. So for this, we want it to be cursor pointer. And we will want to add some sort of transition. So let's do transition. We want it to be transform. And we want it to delay for 500 milliseconds. And also on hover, we want to scale it to 110%. Now we will add an on-click function, which we will also define later. And what this will do is when we click on this, we want to navigate to the actual blog page. So we will implement this later. Next, we want to add the tab index. Let's give it 0. And we will give it an area label. This is for accessibility purpose. We will give this a string literal. And we can say read more about, and then add the blog title. All right, so now let's go ahead and implement the actual blog item. So I will give this a class name. And I'll give it a padding left, right, bottom, and yeah, left, right, bottom, up 1. I'll give it a roundness of large, and give it a shadow of medium. On hover, I want the shadow to be a bit bigger, so I'll give it large. And I'll add some transition and give it a duration of 300. Inside this, I will also render an image, which we will receive from our blogs. So let's give the image source. And if we navigate back, in here, our image is going to be fields.image.fields.file.url. So let's go ahead and do that. So we will need to pass the blog.fields.blogimage.fields.file and then .url. For alternative, let's give it the following. We will say the cover image for whatever the blog title is. So let me go ahead and copy this. And this is a mistake. Okay. Let's give this a class name. Let's make the width full. Give it a height of 60. And also give it a bit of roundness. So let's give the roundness large and make its object cover. All right, so we have a couple of errors. That's because initially our blocks is null, and then later on it fetches it. So we would have to add some error handling in there. So let's go ahead, and before we render our component, we want to check if blocks is null. If that's the case, then let's just return null. Let's go ahead and reload this page. So as you can see, we have our blocks page added, and we have our images. On hover, we can see that it's also highlights or scales it correctly. So let's go ahead and add the error fix for this. So for example, we are missing the key, so we would want to add the key here. So for the key, we want to give it the block ID. All right. So the next thing we would want to add is some information about this block, and when user clicks on it, it should navigate to the specific block page. So let's go ahead with the implementation. All right. So instead of returning now, this was just to fix the error. We want to rather display no blocks or something useful to the user when there is no blocks. So let me go ahead and make some modifications. So I will copy this whole thing here. And in here, I will use the conditional rendering. So I will check if our blocks dot length is greater than 0, then we want to render a div. And this div will contain our block content. So this one that we defined. If that's not the case, then we simply want to render a p tag, and what we want to tell the user is, for example, no blocks found matching your search criteria. So let me go ahead and save that. We will need to move this into a different and store it here. So let's call this filtered blocks. And now we will rather check the filtered block instead of checking the actual block length. So we will check the filtered block and we would provide this here. All right, so as you can see, when we search for something that doesn't match, we see this no blocks found matching your criteria. So let's go ahead and add a flex. We'll give it items center, and we will also give it justify content between, so we can see it here. We also want to give it maybe a gap of 10. Yes, and when we are on smaller screens, we want to give it flex wrap. All right, so this has enough space to get for the content. One other improvement we can make is to reduce this. So let's make this 10 instead of 40. One quick improvement we can make is to make this width full. So in here, I'm going to actually remove this and give it width full. I'll go ahead and save that so we can see that. So now we would have to decrease our input size. So let's make it 1.5. Yes. All right. Or maybe even, yes, 1.5, not 1/5. So this is better. All right. One other thing I would want to do is to remove this divider. This was just for demo purpose, so this looks much better than having the divider. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the other content for each of these. So back in our VS Code, we have already added our image. So the next thing we want to add is a title. So let's give it an H3. And we will render the block title. I'll give it a class name, and I'll give it a margin top of 5. Make the text extra large, and also give it truncate because we don't want to show the whole thing if it's too long. Also, let's give it a P, and this is where I'll render the block summary. So the block dot fields dot block summary. Let me show it so we can see the block summary there. So for this one too, let's go ahead and give it a class name. I'll give it a margin top of 3, margin bottom also of 3, so that's margin Y. And I'll give it the text base, so we don't need to change it. By default it's using the text base. We'll give it a minimum height of 6, and we will also add a truncate, so we don't want to display the whole text. So we can see how weird this looks. It expands based on the size, so if I add a truncate, it will even distort the look. Let's save that. So you can see the width is expanding based on the text. Instead of using the flex, we can use grid for this. So I'll go ahead and give this a grid and give this a grid column, define it 1. Also on medium screens, I want the grid to be 2, and for larger screens I want the grid to be 3, and I'll give it a gap of 10, and I'll give it a padding X of 5, and for medium and larger screens I want the padding to be 0. Let's save that. So you can see this is way better than what we had before. The last thing we want to do is to add a span, which will say read more, and this is just to indicate to the user that this is clickable. So we'll change this to a text secondary, and we'll make it underline, and also give it a spacing of 3. Alright, so this will be all. When the user clicks this, is supposed to navigate to the right blocks page. So if you remember, we defined certain things that we are not using. So I'll go ahead and clean this up. So we don't need this. I'll also remove this, and I will be importing the use navigation. And in here, I'll define a navigate, and let's call it use navigate. So now what I will do is, whenever the user clicks on this block item, I want to navigate to the actual block page. So on click, we want to navigate. Let's provide the block link. So that means now we have to create this block link, and in order to do so, we will need to create a utility file. So let's go ahead and add a utility file. If we go into our source, I can create a new utility file, details, and this one we will call it block link generator. So it will just be a function which takes in the block title, and what it does is going to get we are going to create an ID from this title. So let's call it block title ID, and we'll just do the block title dot split, and in here we are going to join with space, sorry, with hyphen. So now we will return a string literal and give this blocks and we will pass in the block title ID that we just defined. So I will copy this, and instead of this hello, I'm going to replace it. So the block link generator, and it's expecting the block title. So let's go ahead and pass that. Let's save that. If we go back into our browser and we click on one of these, you can see the URL changes to this block title but hyphenated, and this is exactly what we want. The reason why it's not working now is we've not implemented the actual page, so we will go ahead and do that next. Alright, so this will be all for the actual blocks page. So let's go ahead and implement the individual block. So back in our VS Code, I'll go into our main, navigate to our app.jsx, and we are going to pass the blocks to our block page as well. So we will also make some modification to how the route is. Here we want to remove this title and just pass the ID. So this is how we want our URL to be. We don't need to define a unique ID and a title. The title is just enough because we made it unique in our Contentful. Alright, so let's go ahead and implement the blocks page. So I'll go into this page now, and in here I will be importing the following. So the first thing I want to import, let's go ahead and import it before this layout. I will import React from React, and I'm also going to import the use params from the React router. I will go ahead and get the block ID. So if we remember, we are calling the parameter block ID. So I'll go ahead and destructure that from our use params. And the next thing I want to do is I want to get the actual block, so call it block. And if you remember, when we generated the link, we hyphenated it, so we want to undo that. So I will do blocks. Let's destructure the blocks that we pass, blocks.find, and I'm going to get the block, and I will just get our current block dot fields dot entry name to be equal to the current, so cons block entry name from ID will now be block ID dot split, and we will join it with a space. So if this matches with that, then we have our block. So let's do an early return if we don't find the block. So if block is not found, what we want to do is we want to return a layout, and in here we will render a p tag and we'll say block not found. Okay, but if that's not the case, then our block is found. So let's go back and try this. If I click on our sorting, we can see blocks page found. All right. Another thing we want to do is to implement breadcrumbs, so that when we navigate here, we can go back by clicking on the blocks instead of using the back navigation button that is provided by the browser. So I'll go ahead and go into my component, and I'm going to add a new component. This component will go into a new folder I'll create. Let's call it blocks, and we will call it the breadcrumbs. So I will import the breadcrumbs here. At the moment, we are not rendering anything, so I'll just go ahead and call it right before we render the actual block details. So call the breadcrumbs, we will pass the block link, and this is going to be the blocks. And the blocks ID. So let's use the string literal $, and let's pass the block ID here. Close this, and now let's go ahead and implement this component. So this component is quite simple. Let me go ahead and import React. I will create a component called breadcrumbs, which is expecting the block link, and we can export it as default. All right, so now I will return the following. So I'll create a nav, and I'll use ordered list. I'll give this a class name and give it a flex. I'll give it a margin top of 16, and I'll call it I'll give it an area label of breadcrumbs because we already have a navigation defined. So let's call this breadcrumbs. And now for our ordered list, I'll give this a class name, and I'll give it an inline flex. I'll make the item center, give it a space X of 1, and on medium screen I want the space X to be 2, and I'll give it on RTL space X to be reversed. Let's add the actual list items. So this will be expecting an anchor tag. We'll give it the href. By default, if we click on this, it should navigate to the home. So let me go ahead and give it a class name. I'll make it inline flex, item center, give it a gap of 2, text small, font I want it to be medium, and on hover I want the text to be primary. All right, so let me go ahead and close this, and in here I'm going to give a span element, and I'll write home. I'll also go ahead and import this FA icon from React FA and provide it here. Let's save that. So if we go back, we can see right on top here we have the home. So we will go ahead and make similar list item for the blocks page. So this will navigate to blocks. We will change this to blocks, and also we would be importing this FA chevron right. So now I can replace this with the chevron right. So we can see that's right on top here. And then the last one we would want is we want to render the actual link. So this is going to render the name, so the block link that we are getting from the parameter, and this we are going to give it the text color primary. So if we go back, we can see it's right there. Also, we can do some modification. Instead of passing the block ID, we can just go ahead and pass the block title with the hyphenation. So let me go ahead, and so this is much better than what we had. Also, one improvement is to give this a different color. So by default we want the text color to be secondary, and we also want to add cursor pointer. So I'll copy this and give it to this as well. Yes, so this is it. When you hover on it, you can see the changes. So the primary shows which one is highlighted at the moment. All right, so that will be all for the breadcrumbs. So let's go ahead with the next implementation, which will be the actual component. So I will navigate back into my folder and I'll create a new file called block page component. And what this block page component does is we are going to import. So let's define the component. We're going to import React from React, and also define the block page component, which will be expecting date, tags, and the content itself. We will go ahead and export this as before. And back in our blocks page, we want to pass this. So we will import the block page component, and here I'm going to replace this with that component. So let's clean this up and call this block page component. We will pass the date, and the date is going to be new date, and we can get it from the blog.system.created@.sys.created@, and we can get the local date string. We will also need to pass the tags, which will be the blocks.metadata.tags. And lastly, we want to pass the content. So that will be blog.fields.blog_entry.content. And let's close this. All right, so back in our blog page components, let's go ahead and add the implementation. In here, I'm going to return a div, and let's put this in a bracket. In this div, I'll create another div. Let's save it. Let's give this a class name. We will give it a max width of 4 extra large and max width margin X of auto. We'll give it a padding X of 4. And on smaller screens, we want the padding to be 6. And on larger screens, we want the padding to be 8. Also, padding top and bottom should be 10, and give it a gap of 10. Make it flex, and make it flex column. In this div, we want to give it a class name, and this class name we want to make it flex. Item should be center, and also give it a flex wrap. We also want to give it a gap of 3, and for smaller screens we want the gap to be about 5. I will create a span. I'll give it a class name and give it a text secondary. So we are basically defining the dates and some other things we want to see in our blog page. So give it the dates that we passed, and I will go ahead and import an icon that we will need. So we will call this icon go horizontal rule, and it's coming from the React icons, and it's coming from the Go library or folder. So let's render that icon. We'll give it a size of 30. And also a class. Let's give this text secondary. Lastly, we will render our tags, which is a component that we have to create. So I'll just pass the right values there, but I will comment it out for now. Let's save this and check our browser. Check. Okay, so we can see our dates, and we are expecting the tags to be there, but because we are not rendering it, that's why we don't see anything at the moment. So let's go ahead and make those changes. So next, I'm going to go ahead and create the tags. So let's go ahead and add a new file. In our blocks, I will add a new component file called tags.jsx. In here, I will just use the RAFC, and let's go ahead and render the actual component. So this is expecting an array of tags. So let's pass that as a prop. And here I'm going to map through each of them. Let me disable my Copilot quickly. Yes, so let's go ahead and map through. We will get the tag. We will also get the index. And this is supposed to be in a bracket. And then the next thing is we are going to return a span element. So let me create a span. And we will render the tag. So we'll give the key for the span as index. Also, we will give it a class name. And for the class, we are going to render it in a conditional manner. So let me use our string literal. Let's not forget to put this in curly brackets. Yes. So for the basic styles, I want to give it padding horizontal of 2. I'll give it the vertical 1 I'll make it text small, and I'll make the opacity 60. Also, I'll give it some roundness, so the border radius, and I'll make it capitalized. Next, what I want to do is, based on the index, I'm going to render the background color and also the text color. So if our index modulo, I will need to use, yes, the $sign. Okay, so if I modulo 5, because I'm expecting a variety of, like, the tags can be any number, so I'm rendering for 5 different colors. So if the current index modulo 5 is equal to 0, then I want to render the following. I want to render a background of primary and a text of white. Else, if our text, our index, so this is index, let's change this to I so that we don't have to type index everywhere. So if I modulo 5 is equal to 1, then we want to render the following. Let's go ahead. So I will render a background yellow and a text of black. So we will keep on doing this. So we will also want to do it when our index is 2. So that we are going to change the background to purple, and then we will make the text white. And then lastly, we will check if the modulo is equal to 3. Then we are going to render a background of secondary, and we will use the text white. And if all these conditions are not met, then we want the background to be pink. Let me go ahead and save it, and there is a typo somewhere. So this is supposed to be equal to 0. All right, so these are the conditions, and this is essentially rendering the tags in formats in different colors. So some tags will have a background of orange and a text color of white. So that will be all for the item itself. So let's go ahead and give the container some styles. So for the container, I'm going to give it a flex, and then I'll give it a gap of 2. I'll also make it flex wrap. Also, I will need to create a utility function here called get tags, and we will pass in the tags that we are receiving from the parent component. And what this will do is it will just return the tags, so tag, and then it should just return the tag.system. All right, so the next thing is we just need to get a tags array. So for this tags, we need to map through it, and we will get the tag, and what we need to do is we need to return the tag.sys.id. Yeah. All right, so that will be all for the tag. And now if we go back in here, I can uncomment this, and I can go ahead and import the tags component. Let's save it. Let's make sure there are already some tags. So I will console log tags, and then let's open the developer tools. So there are no tags for this particular one. So let's go back to blocks. Let's try this one. So as you can see, we have tags for this, and our component is rendering the correct tag. So this is exactly what we want. All right, so that's going to be all for the tags. The next thing we are going to work on is the content itself. So we are going to add a component called the content render. So I will go ahead and import, and we will create that shortly. So this is called a content renderer, and we will be importing it from the root, this folder, so where we have our blocks. And we will render it right after this. So it's going to go right before the closing div. So let's go ahead and create that component. So I'll create a new file called contentrenderer.tsx. This is supposed to be JSX, sorry. I'm used to developing in TSX, but this project is in JSX. All right, so for the content renderer, we will go ahead and use a RAFC. It's expecting content as the prop. If we go back here, we can see that we are going to pass the content. So let's go ahead and pass it already here. All right, so now that we have the content, all that we need to do is we need to map through the content. So content.map, and for each content, we are going to get the block, and then we are going to get the index, and we are going to return. So if I go ahead and console log the content, we can explore what is inside. So let's save it, okay, and open this. So if I open, you can see this is our content, and there are different type of content. We have a node type called heading, we have paragraph, header 2, ordered list, paragraph. Also we have embedded asset block, which is I'm assuming an image. Yes, so it's an image. We also have I think the code. So for the code, if I open this, was it the meta? One of them has the code as a type. So I'm trying to find which one. Yes, so for example, this one is the code. So in our Contentful, we added some text that was in the code format. So for this, the max is type is called code, and all these things we will need to take into account and render them. So the first thing we would have to do is I'll go ahead and install this package called React Code Block, and that's what we will use for rendering the content for the code. So the text, the code text. So let's go into our npm. Maybe I should open a new tab. Okay. cd into front end, and then we can do npm install react code blocks. So while this is installing, I'll collapse this. Let's make sure it's installed. Yes. Okay, so it was already installed. So let's go ahead and collapse this. We are going to import code block and Dracula from our React code blocks. Let me clean this console log, and then yes, let's put this in a bracket, and then let's continue. So in here, I'm going to create a switch, and this switch will be based on the node type. This is type. Make sure it's recording. Yes. So for the case, we saw examples like the heading 1, paragraph, embedded text or code block. So we need to make sure we are rendering each of these cases. So for the heading, let's deal with the header 1. So heading 1, I want to return the following. So I want to return an h1 tag, And what this would do is I'll get the actual block, so the block.content, and then I'm going to map through it. I'll get the text node and the text index. Then I'm going to return a span, pass the key as the text index, and render the text itself. So that's going to be text node dot value. We also need to pass the key. So for the key, I'm going to pass this as the index. As we can see, we have the text here already. I'll give it a class name, and I'll give it a margin of margin bottom of 6. In addition to this, let's reduce the text size. So let's make it extra large. Okay, so let's make it 3x. Okay, or maybe like 6. Okay, I think 6 is better. So this will be the text size. That will be all for our header 1. Let's go ahead and copy this and make the same for header 2. So change this to header 2, and as you can see, we have it there already. We will change this to 2, and we'll make the font weight normal. Yeah. Yes. So that's for our header 2. You can also decide to give it a different font weight. All right. So the next one we have is the case of our paragraph. So for our paragraph, as I explored the array, we have the code, and then we have the normal text. So let's go ahead and handle that. So let's change this to paragraph. And in here, I'm going to use an if statement. So if our block.content.length is greater than 0, and our block.content at position 0 or index 0 has some max. So if the max.length is also greater than 0, and our block.content at index 0 dot max at 0 dot type is equal to code, then what we want to do is we want to return a pre-element with key as the index. Give it a class name, and this class name we are going to give it a margin bottom of 4, and then we'll close this. And next, what we will do is we are going to render the code block. So we are going to make use of this import that we did earlier on. So let's go ahead and do the code. And this has different properties. So for the code, we will pass it as a text. So we will pass the block.content, and then we will map it. And here we'll get the text node. This is a typo, so the text node, and we can return its value. So text node dot value. Let's close this. So as you can see, we already have the code section there. We can also add some styles, assuming most of our content will be in JavaScript, so we can give it the language as JavaScript, but this could be rendered based on the language that the code is written in. So you can modify this further to be customizable based on the language, but I'll make JavaScript as the default so we can see the change in the style. I also want to show the numbers, which is already shown. For the theme, that's why I imported this Dracula. So you can import different types of theme. And for mine, I want to use Dracula because I'm using dark theme. So this will match it better. So this is the one I'm using. And lastly, I will give the wrap line. Yes. All right. So that's all for our code block. If our content is not code, then what we want to return is the following. So let's add an else statement. And then here, this is supposed to be outside of this. So else, what we want to return is something similar to this one here. So I'll go ahead and copy that and change this to an h1 tag, a p tag. The key, we can also remove this and then give this a margin bottom of 4, and then yes, change this to content. Okay. Yeah, so as you can see, we have the text here. So this is exactly what we want to do. If the mark has some content in it, then we want to render the code. If not, we render the normal text. All right, so let's go ahead and continue with the other type of content, node type that we want to take care of. So the next one is going to be a case for our embedded assets block. So that's images and other sorts of assets or videos. So let's go ahead and get the assets. Get it from block.data.target. And I'm going to return a div. Let's close this div. Here I'm going to pass the key, and that will be our index. I'm also going to give it a class name, and for the class name I'll give it a margin bottom of 4. Let's go ahead and render the main image. So let's use the image tag. Let's close it. And in here, I'm going to give it a source. And for the source, I'll be using the string literal. And what I want to do is to pass the HTTPS. And we can pass the assets .field .file .url. So we can already see our image there. Let's go ahead and give this an alternative text. So our alt text will now be the assets .fields .title. So the image comes with the title, and okay, there is a typo somewhere. This will come down, and then we have to close this. Yeah. All right. And for the assets, I think we don't need to do much about it. The last thing we would want to do is to add the description. So for example, if this image was designed by Figma, we want to give the the copyright or the right mention to the designer. So I'll go ahead and render this conditionally. So if it's not designed by us, then we want to check if the field has some sort of description. If that's the case, then we want to render a p tag, and then we will render that description. So do the assets .fields .description. Let's go ahead and save it. And for this one, I'm going to give it a class name. I will give it text aligns. The text should be centered. So align, center. So for this, what I want to do is I'm going to give it flex. And then I'm also going to give it align. So I'll go ahead and change this to flex. I'll make it flex column. And then I'm going to give it a margin still of 4. And then I'm going to give it a gap of 2. So that's between the image, this image here, and its description. So now for the description, I'm going to give it a self of center. So you should push it to the middle. Let's remove the highlight. And also for the text, I'm going to give it white. And I'm going to make it a bit smaller. So let's give it small. All right, so that will be the all we need to do for copyrights or anything that has to do with the image description. The next thing we have to do is to take care of the hyperlink. So anything that has to do with link, we have to take care of that also. So let's go ahead and create a new case. So we'll call this case hyperlink. And this will return a span. And let's pass the key as the index. Save it. And this is supposed to be in a bracket. Inside this, we will go ahead and copy this one because all of them are going to be very, very similar. So instead of a span, we will use the A tag, and we will also pass the href. So let me go ahead and pass the href. So that's going to be the block dot data. So we will need the span. Let me close it. And we will pass the key as the text ID, the text index. And now we can go ahead. Okay, there is something missing. Okay, this is supposed to be N. So now we can render our A tag. So href and this is going to be our block.data.uri, and we will render the text. So the text node dot value. Let me save it. All right, so that will be all for our hyperlink. The last but one will be our list. So when we have list items, we need to also cater for that. So let me give it ordered list. And here I'm going to return our ordered list. We'll give it a key. That will be our index. So for this, we will need to map through the block. So block.content dot map. We will get the item, and get the item index, and then we are going to return an li element, and in here we are going to give it a key item index. For the return value, let's go ahead and map through our item dot content dot map, and we are going to get the text and the text index. So now we can just return our span with key as the text index, and then we can render the value as the node value. All right, so that will be all for the ordered list items. We don't have any of them here, but we can go ahead and copy this one that we just created for our normal list item, so the unordered list. So list item, and this one we just changed it to UL. That will be all. All right, and by default, if all these cases are not met, we want to return now. So that's going to be all for our content renderer. Let's go ahead and test. So if I go back to blocks and click on this one, we have it working nicely. Click on this, this is also working, and lastly they are all the same. If I click on that, this is also working. So this is nice. We are done with majority of the work. If we try to search, so a look into it works. Let's type something that doesn't exist, that also works. All right, so one thing we want to add is, for example, when we go in here, we want to also display some latest blocks, excluding whatever we are viewing. So we will go ahead and add that. Yes. Oh, okay. So we are, yes. So one thing we need to also take care of is if there is no tags, then we don't want to show this. So we need to conditionally render this. So I want to say if tags dot length is greater than 0, then we want to render this. Yeah, so if there is no tag, then it doesn't render it at all. Yes. And this one also, we can, yeah, so we can put this one also here, which means we would have to now wrap this around an empty tag. Yeah, so if we go back and we click on this, yes, it's working nicely. We click back on this. Okay, perfect. So let's go back into our blocks. Go back into the main front end. Go back into source, and then we go into our routes blocks. We've implemented this block page. So the index, if we navigate here, we need to continue with the implementation of displaying the individual blocks. So that's going to be here right after this component. This is what we just finished working on, the content page. So now we would create a new component, and what we will call it is recent blocks. So let me go ahead and add a new component into our blocks. Call it recent 3 blocks, because we want to only display 3 of them. So recent 3 blocks dot GSX. And let's use the RAFC. Okay. Turn a div and say recent 3 blocks. Alright, so in here, I'm going to go ahead and import that. So our recent 3 blocks. And we are also going to pass the blocks to it, which is going to be the recent 3 blocks. So for this one, what we need to do is we need to create a new variable, which is called the recent blocks. And this will get the recent 3 recent blocks. We will pass in the blocks, and then we'll also pass in the block ID. We will add this as a utility file, so let's go ahead and do that. So let's go into our utility folder, source, utility, and create a new file called 3 recent blocks. .gs, and then we are going to export it as a const. So get 3 recent blocks is expecting blocks, and also the block ID, which we can give the initial value as empty. So what we want to do is we will get the block sorted. So blocks.sort, let's say first block, second one, and then we can get the created at A, which will be a new date. Can get a.system or sys.created at for our block A. We don't need this, and we need to do the same for the block B. So first block, second block. All right, and then we can return the block B minus block A. So this is just how you sort things in JavaScript, but we are just using the date instead. So it will use this function to compare the dates and sort them according to the recent date and the latter date. Okay, so now that we have that, we are going to get the, we're going to create a new variable, and then we can call it recent blocks. We'll use the sorted blocks, and then we can filter all the block, because if you remember, I said we want to get 3 most recent block, and we don't want the current block that we are on to be part of this list, so we have to filter it out. ID is not equal to the block ID. So this is block ID instead. And now we can return recent blocks.slice, get the first 3. So the 3 most recent blocks, and that will be all. So if we go back into the block page, we can go ahead and import this. So I will import this from our utils, and then 3 recent blocks. Okay, let me reload this and then see. Let's go ahead and console log it. So that I can get it clean. Okay, okay, so there is some error somewhere in the sorting. So let's go back and make sure everything is as expected. So okay, Okay, so we actually need to move this to right after checking if the blocks is not empty. Because if it's empty, then this is going to give an error. So we are already handling it here. We just need to move the declared variable down. So, all right, let me clean this and reload the page. Okay, so we still have some error in the tag. PR is not recognized. I can just go ahead and change it to something else that's interesting. So here we can just simply change it to a div also. And then reload it. See, okay, this can be ignored. Let's explore this. So we can see we have the 3 most recent blocks here. All right, so let's go ahead and implement that component. Back in our recent 3 blocks component, we are going to get the blocks prop and we are going to render it. So the first thing we want to do is we are going to give this a class name and we are going to make this a grid. So we will use the grid, give it grid calls of 1. We are also going to make it for medium screen, we want the columns to be 2, and then for large screens, we want the grid columns to be 3. Also, we want to give it a gap of 10, and then we want to give it a padding horizontal of 5, and for medium and bigger screens, we don't want any padding. Next, we want to render the actual component, so let's go ahead and map through these blocks. Dot map, we will get the block, and this is supposed to be in a bracket. Then we can return this. Okay, so for this one, we are going to use a div. Let me close this. We will give this a class name. And for the class name, we'll give it cursor pointer. We will also give it a transition, transform, and we'll make the duration 500. And on hover, we want to scale it to 110. Next, we will give it a tab index of 0. Inside this, we will create another div. And for this div, we will also give it a class name. We will give it a background of this color. This is a custom color. We are not using it in many places. That's why it's defined here. 228. And then we will give it a roundness of large. We will make overflow hidden. And then we'll give it a bit of shadow. So the shadow should be large. And for the height, I'll give it 300 pixels. So we can see them down here. All right, so now let's go ahead and create an image. The image source is going to be our block dot fields dot block image dot fields dot file dot URL. So that's the image. And for the alternative, we can do the same block dot fields dot image dot fields. For the alternative, we can just do block dot fields, then we can use the entry name. Also, we will need to, let's say, remove one of the brackets. Okay, for this one, we can do the title. And for this, let's give it a class name. For the class name, we'll give it a width full. We'll also give it a height of 40. And then for objects to be cover. So exactly this. Next, let's go ahead and give the following and write the code for the content itself. So for the content, we will need an H3, and then we are going to render the following. So the block dot fields dot entry name. Save it. So we have it there. Next, we also need a p tag. And for this, we are just going to render the block summary. So we have that. Let's go ahead and add some class. So we'll give this a padding of 5. And then in here, we're also gonna give it a class name. We will make the text font extra large. We'll give the font semi-bold. Yes. And then we will also give it margin bottom of 2. All right, now the last thing is the text for the content. So let's give it a class. We'll give it text small, and then we'll give it text gray 400. All right. Well, additionally, we also want to make it overflow on Y. Here, overflow on Y hidden. So if the text is too long, we want to hide it. So that's it. We will need to add a title to make this look a bit nice. So let's go ahead and add a title here just before we render the component. So close this, and in here I'm going to move this into a div, and then we can give this a title. So we can use H3. Let's say recent blocks and save. So we have that. Let's give it a class name, and then we are going to give it text for extra large. Then we want the font to be medium and margin bottom to be 10. So that's all for this. Next, we want this to be clickable. When we click on it, we want to go to the right page. So for that, let's go back into our recent blocks, and then we are going to import the use navigate. We will also import the block link generator. How did we name it? So this, if you go into the utilities, this one here, from utils and then block link generator. The other thing we also need to import is the scroll to top. So use scroll to top. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to define navigate. And we can use the navigate. And in here we can extract the scroll to top. And we can call scroll to top. Define a function called navigate to clicked blog. So for example, blog. I'm going to navigate to the blog link generator. So generate blog link. And then we can also scroll to top afterwards. This is a function call. And now we are going to pass this to this. So on click, we are going to call this function. And then we can pass in the ID. So the block. Okay, let's see what this accepts. Yes. So we need to pass in the entry name. Can pass in blog.fields .entry name. Okay. One thing I'm noticing is if we go back in here, we can see it's changed. So this one also, okay, go here. Okay, we need to fix something. So for our get through recent blocks, let's make sure we are passing the correct block ID. So in here, yes, we will need to pass in the current block ID. So this one needs to be passed to this function, which we passed. Oh, okay, so we need to bring this here and then pass the blog.id instead. So we will need to move these recent blocks down here. And then we are going to pass the blog.sys.id instead, so that it filters out the current block. So this is exactly what we want. So now we can use these same recent blocks on our home page because we are still using these ones that we have. So we will need to change these ones to use the contentful data. So let's go ahead and go back into our routes, and we will navigate into the routes. We will also need to change these. So for this one, we are passing the recent blocks, and the recent blocks are what we define in the utilities, and we are getting the blocks from the app. So if there's no block, we just return now from there, so it doesn't even render this section. The next thing is we need to change these ones. So for this one, we need to say fields.entry name. Save it, so it will change it. Also, we need to change the image. So for this one, we need to pass, let's change this to fields.block summary. And let's go ahead and console log this to see exactly what the values are. So if we open this, for example, we have the fields. So, okay, so this one will be fields.block image. And then if we open the block image itself, we have fields again, and then we have file, and then we have URL. Save it. So we have the image, and then we can pass in the block.id, and same for this block.id or .sys.id. Can remove this. So that would be all for this part. We can clearly see we have all our blocks and then the titles. So I can go ahead and save it. So we can see that we actually have a duplicate component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this into our shed. So I'll go ahead and move this into our shed and save it. So instead of, yes, so this is now going to import it from the shed. We have it still working as expected. And then we can, let me expand this page. We can go back into our block. So in here, we can remove this because it's basically doing the same thing. So I'll go ahead and remove that. So this, we want it to be imported from shed and then tags. So instead of, yes. So instead of creating double components, we'll just use one. Okay, that was my mistake. So we can go ahead and make those changes. So back in our blog page in the route, so here we can now pass in, so the blocks dot map, and then we can get a tag and get the tag .sys.id. Let's go ahead and save that, clean this, and if we navigate to this block, okay, we also need to fix that. So back in our blog page, back in our blog item, let's make sure we have the right URL. So index, on click of this, we are supposed to navigate to the right page. Or when we click on the read more. Yes, so currently we are not doing anything, so we will need to make the necessary changes for that. So let's go ahead and define and navigate, and we'll use navigate. And then what we will do is in here we'll give it on click. So right here on click, we will create a function and we'll say it should navigate to our block link generator, and then we'll pass in. That's my mistake. Okay, so this should work now. If I click on it, as you can see, it leads us to the right page, into our home page. So if I click, let's say this one, it sends us to this page. Yes. So the next thing we are going to work on is this contact me section. At the moment, it's not functional. So if we enter our name, subject, and the mail, it doesn't do anything. All right, so let's start with the backend by creating a new folder. So I'll use the mkdir backend, and I'm going to cd into this. And after that, I'm going to run npm init and provide the option y to accept all the questions it will ask. So now you can see that we have a new JSON package. I will also go ahead and add the following. So I'm going to clear this, and I'm going to add a new file called .getignore. So getignore. And in here, I'm also going to add the following. So for the node modules, we don't want it to be committed. And then we also want to add the .environment variables. Let's not forget to add a dot. All right, so now that we have all these things set up, the next thing I would want to do is to install all the packages that we will need. So for this backend, it's quite simple. We will need to install, so I'll write npm install express. So we'll be using the express framework for the backend. We will install course, and we'll also install .environment, and the last thing is the node mailer. Since we are dealing with a contact me section, we'll be using node mailer to handle this. Now let's navigate into our package.json, and in here I'm going to make some small modifications. So I'll remove this test script that we have, and I'm going to add the run script. So we will name it start, and then the next thing I'll do is to use nodemon. You can use node. I prefer nodemon because I don't want to restart the server anytime I'm trying to set something. And I have the nodemon installed globally, so that's why I didn't have to add it to the package.json. And we will be naming our app server.js. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so that will be all for our package.json. I'll go ahead and create a new file. We'll call it the server.js. So this is the file that we will be using mostly. So let's go ahead and continue with the implementation. I'll close this git ignore and navigate into my server. First, I'm going to import Express. So I'll require it from Express. Next, I'm also going to import the node mailer. So as I mentioned, the node mailer is just a package that is going to be responsible for handling our mail service, so sending the mail to the user, and also the user sending the mail to us. So we'll receive it and give the user an auto reply. We'll also need a course for cross origin purposes. So let's go ahead and require that. And then lastly, I will also import my .environment, which we will need for setting up the environment variables we would need for the node mailer. All right, so now that I have this set up, I'll go ahead and call the config method that is provided by .environment. And next I'm going to create our app. So we will call the Express. And I will also be using the following middlewares. So I will use the course middleware, and then I will use the Express JSON because the API we are creating will be a post, and we want to handle how the body is read. Previously, you would have used something like body parser, but now Express has this method that you can use, which is the Express JSON, and that's what we are going to use. Express.json. All right, and I'll also define my port. I'll be using the port 3030. And now let's go ahead with the actual API implementation. So the first thing we want to do is in node mailer, we want to create something called the transport. That's where we are going to define the service that we want to use. For example, if you want to use Gmail, Hotmail, or Outlook, something that has to do with mail service, this is where you're going to define it. So I'll go ahead and call it transporter, and we will be calling the node mailer. As you can see, it provides us with these options, and we will use the create transport. This is expecting some objects. If I hover on it, you can see that it's expecting the transport and some other configuration that we will need to add. So the first thing I want to add is the service name. So the service that we want to use is Gmail. You can feel free to add whatever service you prefer. And we will also want to use the host smpt.gmail.com. And next we will define this port, which will be 465. And we will also want to provide it as secure. So we will set secure to true. All right, so the last thing we would want to do is to configure our auth. So for example, when you're trying to log in into your email, you have to provide your username or your email and also the password. And that's exactly what we are going to do here. So in here, I'm going to name it user. And we will be getting that from our process.environment. and we will go ahead and add this very soon, but for now let me just add this. So now let's go into our .environment, which we haven't created. So let's create a new file called .env, and we can navigate there. In here, I'm going to add two main variables. The first one is our Gmail username for our authentication, so Gmail username, and the second one is going to be the Gmail app password. And for this password, we are not going to use the exact password we use for logging into our email. We'll be using a different format. So I'll just, for security purposes, I'll just write your email here, and I'll go ahead and go into my browser and show you how we will get this password. Let's go into our browser. So in our browser, you have to go into your Google account. So you go into your manage your Google account. So we will need to access this myaccount.google.com app password. When we go there, what we want to do is first you will need to verify yourself. So let's go ahead and put the password. Once you've verified who you are, you will be navigated to this page. So what this will do is it's going to generate a new password for us. So instead of us using our original Gmail password, we would want to use this one. The main reason being we will turn on our two-factor authentication, and when we turn that on and we try to use our personal password to enter into the application, it's going to reject it because there's no way for us to verify the authentication method, so two-factor authentication method. So that's why we will need to create this app password. For demo purposes, you can name it whatever you want, but I am going with the node mailer. So I can just type node mailer, and when I click on create, it's going to generate a new app password for me. So let's go ahead, and this will be the password that we will use. So instead of using your private password, you'll be using this. So I'll go ahead and copy that. Also note that this will be provided to you once and you wouldn't have access to it. So make sure you are saving this before you even click on done. So I'll go back into my VS Code and remove the spaces, and I'll go ahead and click done here. So as I mentioned, for this to work, you need to make sure you have your two-factor authentication enabled. So go ahead and do that also in your Google account. All right, so now that we have this, the next thing is we can now provide the values that we defined here. So for the username, we can provide this, and for our password, we can also provide this value. All right, so that will be all for the transporter. The next thing is we are going to implement the actual API. So I'll create a new post method because, as I mentioned, this will be using the post method. So .post, and I'll name our API. Let's name it API, and then I'll give it send mail. Or I can just use the hyphen. I prefer the hyphen method. And now I can get my request. Also, let me just close this. Yeah, so I can get my request response, and I'll use the arrow function. So now we will be distracting some things from the front end. So as I mentioned, this will be a post method, which means whenever the user inserts their details into the form, we will get this to the request body. So let's go ahead and destructure that. So I'll get the from, the subject of the email, and the message of the email. So that will be gotten from the request.body. We will also need to verify if there is no from or there is no subject. There is no subject, or there is no message. We want to return an error to the front end. So we'll go ahead and return response.status equal to 400 because that's a bad request, and we will send the following. Let's go ahead and send this to the front end. We will send missing required fields, and we can give the from, subject, and message. So now that we have done the verification, let's go ahead with the actual implementation. So for this, we want to do two main things. We want to handle sending the email to ourselves, and also handling auto reply. So when the user sends an email, we want to handle the auto reply. Send other email to just tell the user that we've received their email or whatever we want to write there. So I'll create two main mail options. So let's go ahead and create the first one. I'll call it received mail options. And for this, I will use the from. I'll use the process.environment.gmail username, and actually we will use the from. We will use the user's email. So this one, we don't need to define this. Yeah, we'll use the user's email. And for the to, like to which person, is what we will use our own email that we define in the environment variable. And also the subject, we can provide it here. And lastly, we can provide the message in an HTML form. So I can use the string literals for that. And in here, I'm just going to do a p tag and add whatever the user wants to say. So the message here, and also we can close this tag. I'll go ahead and copy this because we will need the same, almost similar thing for handling the auto reply. So let's go ahead and duplicate that, and we can just change this to auto reply. So the auto reply, we want the from to be from our personal email. So I'm just gonna change this to this, and then actually, yeah, this is from our personal email, and this is gonna go to the from, so to the user's email. And we will use a different subject. So for the subject, we are going to say something along the lines, thank you for contacting me. Thank you for contacting me. And you can maybe put your name here. So let's assume you're called John Doe. You can just put whatever subject you want to put there. And for the message, you can probably write the same thing. You can customize it to your satisfaction. So for demo purposes, I'm just gonna copy and paste this and maybe add this to it also. So I'll get back to you shortly. All right, so now that we have our mail options for auto reply and sending the email to ourselves defined, let's go ahead and create use the transporter send mail to send this mail. So we will first provide the mail options, received mail options, and we can get the error if there is any error. And in here, I'll check if there is error. Then I'm going to return response.status 500 to the front end. And I'm going to say failed to send email. Please try again. But if that's not the case, so if else, then we can create another transporter which will send an auto reply and also handle the error. So it's basically the same thing. And also we will handle the error here. Failed to send auto email, just to differentiate the two. But if everything passes successfully, then within this transporter, we are just gonna return response.send email sent. We can also add the status as 200. All right, so that will be all for this. We will be testing this soon, and let's go ahead and listen to this application. So I'll do the app.listen. I'll provide the port and use this callback. So just do console log and use the string literals. So our server is running on port, whatever port we've defined. So let's say yes. All right, so now we can go ahead and test this application to make sure it's working before we go to the front end to make the necessary changes. So I'll console, I'll run, so I'll go ahead and run npm run start, which will start our server, so we can see that our server has started on port 3000. You can use whatever tool you want to use to test this, like Postman or anything. I personally use this tool, the Tender Client, which is available in VS Code. So it's an extension that you can add. So I'll use it for testing this. I already provided a body that we can use for testing. So let's go ahead. Let's assume I'm sending this email to my personal email. So I'll click on send. And we will wait. So as we can see, email was sent successfully, and I will go back to my personal email. So let's go back to my Gmail just to confirm that we received the email. Yes, so as you can see, this was sent 0 minutes ago, so this is working as expected. All right, so now we can go back into our front end and use this server that we've created. So I'll go ahead and go back into the front end, and I will keep on running this. So I'll add a new terminal and I'll call this front end, or I'll cd into the front end, and I'm going to run npm run dev, I believe, or run start. Yeah, okay, run dev is working. So we can see our application is running nicely. I will navigate into our contact me, and I will put this on the side. Yes, let's close this. So this is our contact me form. Let me reduce the font size a bit. All right, so this is our contact me form, and we will need to handle the send email right here. So in here, first, let's go ahead and import the following. We will import Axios, which I've already installed, and we would also want to import the following icons. So I'm going to import the FA spinner, and I will also import MD cancel from our React icons MD folder. All right, so now that we've imported all the things we will need, I'll add a new state, and we will call this state a sending, and we will set a sending state. By default, we want to set it to false. So inside our send mail, we will be using the try catch to implement this. So let's go ahead and use the snippet try catch. First, I will set a sending to true, and I will also handle the error. So if there is any error, I will just set timeout, and I'm going to return the following, or pass the following to set status. So I will say failed to send email, please try again. And I'll provide the milliseconds as 1 second. And then I'll also set its error to true. If there is no error, then let's go ahead and handle the positive case. So first I'm going to await, and I'll be using axios.post. So if you remember, our API was running on port 3000, so we would have to define that. So let's go ahead and define that here. So our base URL, as you can see, I've already defined it. I'll go ahead and copy it right here and provide this. And we named our API as API send mail. So let's go ahead and provide the request body. If we remember, our request body was from, which will be the form data.email. And then we have the subject, which is also form data.subject. And lastly, we have the message, which is form data.message. So when this is successful, what we want to do is we want to set a sending to false, which means we don't need to, we mainly need this for the spinner, just to show the user that their email is being sent. And then we can go ahead and copy this message. So I'll just replicate this and change this to email sent successfully. All right, and we would also want to clear the form right after that. So we will set the form data to empty object, and we will set error to false. So this is all that we need to do for sending the email. Now we can also try to add some UI changes to this. So for example, when the user is sending the email, we want to show the spinner. So let's go ahead and implement that. So right after the form, I'm going to create an object. And in this object, I'll say if it's sending, then we want to create a div. And this div will call the FA spinner. We'll give it a class name, and we will give it the Tailwind class animate spin. We will also give a span and just write sending email. Let's give this a class name. Let's make it flex and center items. We'll also give it a gap of 2, and we'll give it margin top of 4. Lastly, we will make some small modification to this. So first, I'm going to clean this up, and then we are going to create a div. We will give this a class name, and we will make it string literal. So let's go ahead and do that. So first, I'll give it a margin top of 4 and a padding of 4. I'll make the text white and give it flex and also justify between. I will now render a condition for the background color. So if there is an error, Then I want the background color to be red. So text. Yes, so this, if that's not the case, then I want the background to be text secondary. All right. So now the last thing we would want to do is to add the actual content. So I'll give this a span and add the status here. So the status message, and also I'll add the MD console, give it a class name and make it cursor pointer. I'll give it on click. So when the user clicks on it, we should set the message to clear. So I'll just clear this, which is setting it to an empty object. I'll give it a size of 20 and close this. So that's basically all. Let's go ahead and test our implementation to make sure everything is working. So back in our browser, I'll go ahead and let's say I'm sending an email to, my name is, let's say, Kayla Doe, and I'm sending an email to, I'm using my personal email here, and let's say I'll say, let's work together. Hi, I would like to work together. All right, so now let's click on the send and see if this actually sends the email. So we can see the spinner here, and after a couple of seconds, we can see our email was sent successfully. When we click on this, we should be able to remove this. I'll go back into my email. I don't know what this is. Yes. And see if this was sent. So as you can see, it was sent successfully. All right. So that's going to be all for this tutorials. I already posted the first part of this tutorial. If you haven't watched it, it's going to be in the description down below. But this is a fully functional website. It's deployable, and you can also use it to write your blogs and everything. So I hope you enjoy this and see you in my next video.